My name is Iris Calloway. I am 34 years old. And I want to tell you about the night I wore a dress I had not worn in 2 years, drove 40 minutes across a city I barely had time to visit, and sat quietly at a table while a woman I had never done a single wrong thing to decided that a room full of her husband's colleagues was the right place to remind me of my place in the world.
I want to tell you about that.
But I also want to tell you what happened 31 minutes later, because the second part only means what it means because of the first. You need both. The insult and the answer belong to the same sentence, and I will not give you one without the other. My brother's name is Daniel Calloway. He turned 32 years old in February of this year, and in March, his employer, Harlan Structural Group, promoted him to senior project engineer after 4 years of work that his director later described, in a written citation, as the most quietly consequential contribution they had seen from someone at his level in over a decade. Those are not my words.
I want to be clear about that.
Those words belong to Eleanor Voss, the director of Harlan Structural, and she chose them precisely and meant them entirely. I know because I have read that citation more times than I will admit to in any room where people might ask follow-up questions. The promotion dinner was held at the Meridian Room on the 14th floor of a commercial building in the financial district. It was a Thursday evening, March 6th of this year, and Harlan Structural had reserved the private dining space for an event celebrating 3 simultaneous promotions. The invitations went out to immediate family. Daniel called me 2 weeks in advance and asked me to come. He said, "I want you there. You more than anyone." I said I would be there. I drove 40 minutes across the city after a full workday, arriving at 6:34 p.m. in a navy wrap dress I had bought for a colleague's retirement dinner 18 months earlier and had not had occasion to wear since. I am constitutionally unable to arrive anywhere less than 10 minutes early. This is either a virtue or a mild compulsion, depending on who you ask and what kind of day they have had. I know the building. I want to say that now, before any of the rest of it, because it matters to everything that comes later, and I need you to carry that knowledge with you as you listen. I know that building the way you know a place where you have spent 3 years of your working life. I know what the lobby smells like before 7 a.m. when the cleaning crew is still finishing the marble floors. I know which elevator lags slightly between the 7th and 9th floors because the cable tension was adjusted unevenly during the 2022 retrofit, and the maintenance crew has been managing the symptom rather than correcting the cause. I know the names of the 2 security guards who work the overnight desk on the east entrance. I know because from the spring of 2021 through the late fall of 2023, I served as lead site coordinator on the structural renovation of that building's east wing. A project that began when I was 29 years old and finished when I was 31. A project I will return to in full detail before this story is over. But I will get there. First, I need to take you back further, because stories like mine do not begin at dinner tables. They begin in kitchens 17 years earlier, on the evening when the person who was supposed to hold things together simply decided to stop. It was a Wednesday in October 2009. I was 17 years old. My brother Daniel was 15. Our father, Gary Calloway, did not come home from work that evening. Not dramatically. There was no argument that preceded it, no door slamming, no confrontation I could have later assembled into something that made narrative sense. He simply did not come home. He moved into an apartment with a woman from his accounting office 2 towns over, called my mother the following Thursday morning, and explained in the measured voice of a man who has rehearsed a difficult sentence until it no longer frightens him that he had been unhappy for a long time and had decided it was time to prioritize his own well-being. He suggested she take whatever time she needed to process this. Then he hung up. My mother's name is Carol Calloway. She was 51 years old that October, and she had spent 23 years doing what her generation called keeping house, which is the polite, compressed way of describing the full-time management of every logistical, emotional, scheduling, and administrative function of a household without a salary, a title, or a performance review attached to any of it. She held an associate's degree from the community college she had attended before she married. She had a bone density condition that made extended hours on her feet genuinely and progressively painful. She was not helpless. She was, in fact, more capable and more resourceful than the previous 2 decades had given her occasion to demonstrate. But she was also 51 years old, and she had been outside the formal workforce for more than 2 decades, and the gap between those two facts was not something that resolved itself quickly or without cost. Within 6 weeks, I had a part-time job at a grocery store 2 miles from our house, working weekday afternoons and Saturday mornings. Within 8 weeks, I had added a second position, weekend work for a neighbor named Frank Duarte, who was 63 years old and ran a small property management company overseeing 6 residential rental units in our neighborhood. Frank paid me $12 an hour in cash to help with scheduling, supply runs, tenant communication, and the occasional site visit he could no longer manage comfortably because of the arthritis in both knees. I was 17 years old, and I had never thought seriously about buildings before. I thought about them constantly after that. I learned from Frank in the specific way you learn things when you are operating out of necessity rather than interest, completely, and without the luxury of selective attention. I learned how to read an invoice and cross-reference it against a scope of work and notice when a line item was phrased vaguely enough to expand later into something expensive. I learned that the difference between a manageable repair and a crisis repair is almost always located in the gap between when a problem was first visible and when someone with authority decided to address it. I learned that contractors respect the person who shows up on time and asks the right questions more than they respect the person whose name is on the contract. I learned that buildings, like families, will tell you what is wrong with them if you stay close enough and bring the right quality of attention. They are not mysterious. They are simply waiting for someone to take them seriously. Daniel watched all of this. I want you to understand something about my brother before I go further, because this story is not about a passive person who is carried. Daniel was not passive, and he was not ungrateful, and he was not oblivious to what was happening around him. He was 15 and then 16 and then 17, and he was watching me the way a person watches a process they're trying to internalize before they attempt it themselves. He washed dishes without being asked. He kept his grades high, without anyone pushing him. He researched scholarship applications on the family computer and filled out the forms himself and asked me to review them before he submitted. He had a facility for spatial reasoning that his drafting teacher, a man named Mr. Okafor, recognized formally in April 2010, calling my mother in for a conference to say that Daniel had a rare and specific gift for structural visualization and that the gift would require real resources to develop properly. My mother came home from that conference and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, without speaking. I made dinner, pasta with a sauce from a jar because it was what we had, and then I sat across from her and asked her what had been said. She told me everything Mr. Okafor had said, and then she sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at them. I told her I could pick up an additional Friday shift at the grocery store. She said she didn't want me to have to do that. I said I know.
I did it anyway.
I did not attend a 4-year university. I am going to say that plainly and without apology, because it is a fact that becomes central to this story, and I would rather name it on my own terms than have someone else use it as a weapon without my having had a chance to contextualize it first. I enrolled in evening courses at the same community college where my mother had studied decades before me. I took classes in project management, construction document reading, building systems, and contract administration. I studied on weeknights after double shifts and on Sunday mornings in the 2 hours before the grocery store opened. I read every manual and building code document I could access through the library system. I did not have a diploma from a university with a name that meant anything at a professional dinner table. What I had, by the time I was 21 years old, was a reputation assembled from 8 years of showing up without being late, catching problems before they became costly, and understanding in my bones that the people who actually hold buildings together are very rarely the people who appear in the press releases when the buildings are finished. In the spring of 2013, I left Frank Duarte's property management operation and accepted a position at a mid-sized construction coordination firm called Vantage Site Services. I was 21. I started as an administrative coordinator, which meant I managed scheduling calendars, prepared the weekly progress reports, handled subcontractor communication logs, and processed the documentation that project managers needed organized before they could do anything else. Within 14 months, I had been moved into a junior field coordinator role because the project manager on a mid-rise exterior remediation in the Westover district, a man named Colin Marsh, who had been doing this work for 22 years, noticed that I had been flagging discrepancies in the subcontractor logs that his own team had been missing, and he told the operations director that it was wasteful to keep a person with that kind of eye behind a desk. I spent the next 4 years working field coordination under Colin. He was not warm and he was not patient, but he was honest, which I valued more than either of those things. He taught me how to read structural drawings well enough to have an informed conversation with the engineers, not to do their job, but to understand what they were telling me and to ask the questions that turned their technical assessments into actionable site decisions. He taught me that the most valuable thing a coordinator can do is create a documented record so thorough and so specific that if anything goes wrong 6 months later, every decision point is traceable. He said, "The job is to make the paperwork smarter than the problem." I wrote that down. I still have it. By 2017, I was running my own project coordination assignments independently under the Vantage umbrella. I managed a 4-story mixed-use renovation in the Dellwood corridor from February through November of that year, a project with a total budget of $2.3 million and a timeline that had already slipped 7 weeks by the time I took over the coordination file. I brought it back on schedule within 11 weeks by identifying that the primary delay was a communication gap between the mechanical subcontractor and the structural team. Neither group was consistently reading the other's weekly updates, which meant that conflicts in the installation sequence were not being caught until they had already caused physical problems on site. I created a shared documentation protocol that required both teams to acknowledge each other's weekly submissions before proceeding with the following week's work. It was not an elegant solution. It was a precise one. Daniel's undergraduate program in civil engineering cost $47,200 over 4 years, of which scholarships and financial aid covered $31,600. The remaining $15,600 came from 3 sources: a college savings account my mother had managed carefully and quietly for years without telling either of us how much was in it, a partial contribution from our father's court-ordered child support payments, and a personal loan of $4,800 that I co-signed in the spring of Daniel's junior year when the financial aid calculation came in lower than the previous year and the gap was too wide to manage otherwise. I tracked those numbers in a small green notebook I kept in the top drawer of my desk. I tracked them because they were real numbers and real numbers deserve to be recorded accurately, and because I knew, even then, that there would come a day when someone might try to make me feel that I had not done anything that mattered. I wanted the notebook to exist. He graduated in May 2016. His master's program in structural engineering ran from the fall of 2016 through the spring of 2018, funded primarily through a research assistantship and 2 merit fellowships he had competed for and won entirely on his own. I drove him to his campus visit for the program in September 2016, a 4-hour round trip on a Saturday when I had site documentation due the following Monday morning. I wrote the character reference letter for his application on a Tuesday evening after returning from a 9-hour site visit, drafting it twice and then a third time because the second version sounded like it was working too hard to be convincing. His graduate advisor, Dr. Renata Solis, told him during his first semester that it was the strongest supporting letter in his application file. I did not attend his master's graduation ceremony in May 2018. I had a 7 a.m. site walk scheduled the following morning for a project in its early permitting phase, and I had learned by that point in my life that ceremonies belong to people who have the flexibility to treat a single day as significant without professional consequence. I sent him a card with a money order inside for $250 and a note that said, "Now it is your turn to figure something out." He called me from the restaurant where his cohort was celebrating. His voice cracked when he said thank you. I told him not to ruin my evening with sentiment and to get back to his party. I meant neither of those things. After I hung up, I sat in the parking lot of a hardware supplier in the dark for approximately 4 minutes and cried, quietly, the way I have always cried, without making noise, without letting it last, without allowing it to become anything larger than what it was. Then I drove home and went to bed because I had an early morning. That is the part one have never told him. Daniel met Fiona in the fall of 2018, 3 months after his graduation. She was a marketing consultant with a structured, well-compensated career and the particular self-assurance that develops in people who have never seriously been made to doubt whether they belong in a room. Her family had money in the multi-generational, undemonstrative way, not flashy, simply constant, the way good weather is constant in places where the climate has always cooperated. Her mother hosted dinner parties. Her father sat on the boards of 2 nonprofit organizations. They own a lake house 3 hours north of the city that Fiona mentioned with the easy frequency of someone who has long since stopped noticing that mentioning it communicates anything at all. I met Fiona for the first time at Daniel's apartment on a Sunday evening in November 2018. She shook my hand with practiced, genuine-seeming warmth and asked what I did. I told her I worked in building coordination and site project management. She nodded in the particular way of someone who is placing you inside a category they have already labeled and furnished. She asked whether I had studied architecture. I said no, that my training had come through a combination of work experience and targeted coursework at the community college level. She said that was interesting. Then she turned back toward Daniel. It was not a dramatic moment. It was barely a moment at all, the kind of thing that evaporates before you can hold it still long enough to examine. But I registered it the way I register a small misalignment in a structural drawing, not alarming, not requiring immediate action, just slightly wrong in a way that tends to compound over time if no one names it. Over the following 2 years, Fiona and I saw each other at holidays, birthdays, and the occasional dinner Daniel arranged because he wanted the different parts of his life to feel connected to each other. She was always pleasant. She asked polite follow-up questions and retained small details from previous conversations, which is the mark of someone who is socially skilled enough to make courtesy feel like warmth. She was, in all surface-visible ways, kind. But there was a quality to how she managed my presence in rooms that I noticed and could not stop noticing. When Daniel talked about our shared history, the jobs I had worked, the loan I had co-signed, the years before his career had any particular shape, she would listen with a brief, composed patience, the expression of someone waiting for a conversational stretch to conclude before the real topic resumes. When his professional colleagues or her own family asked about Daniel's background, she answered for him with the smooth fluency of a woman who has quietly taken over the narration of her household story. She was not performing malice. I want to be precise about this because the story is not about a villain, and I did not feel, in those 2 years, like a person being deliberately harmed. What I felt was something more diffuse and more tiring than harm. I felt like a presence being managed, welcomed in the way that complicated things are welcomed when managing them is the easiest available option, but never quite welcomed the way things are welcomed when they are simply wanted. Daniel and Fiona married in June 2021. I sat in the front row of the ceremony in a blue dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. I watched my brother cry when Fiona walked down the aisle, and I thought, as long as he is that happy, the rest of it is manageable. I was fully prepared to be managed. I had 17 years of practice at occupying less space than I was entitled to in rooms my own labor had helped make possible. You get efficient at it. It becomes a kind of muscle memory. What I was not prepared for was the dinner. Which brings me back to the Meridian Room and the 14th floor and the white and sage centerpiece and the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Before I tell you what happened when Eleanor Voss stood at that podium, I want to ask you something. Tell me where you are right now as you hear this, whether it is morning or evening where you are, whether the room around you is quiet or full of the sounds of other people's lives. I ask because I find myself thinking, often, about the geography of who listens to stories like mine, and I am genuinely curious about the distance this one travels. I was seated at a round table with Daniel and Fiona and 2 of his colleagues, Garrett from the Structural Analysis Department and a woman named Priya, who worked in project development, and their respective partners. The table was good-humored and warm in the way of a professional celebration where people are genuinely pleased to have a reason to be together. Garrett asked me early in the evening what I did. I told him I was a site coordinator and project manager, currently overseeing a mid-rise renovation in the Greenfield district. He leaned forward slightly. He asked which project. I mentioned the Halloran building. His eyebrows rose. He said he had heard about that remediation, that a colleague at a competing firm had bid on an early phase and described the site complexity as significant. I told him the East Stairwell Foundation repair alone had taken 4.5 months and required a temporary load transfer system while the original supports were being addressed. He asked several specific, technically informed questions, and I answered them. We talked through most of the appetizer course about the challenges of structural work in occupied residential buildings, the resident notification protocols, the inspection sequencing, the particular difficulty of coordinating noise restrictions with the demands of concrete work. I noticed Fiona watching this exchange. Her expression was the one she gets when she is processing information without permitting it to register on her face. After Garrett turned to speak with someone on his other side, Fiona leaned across the table toward me. Her voice was exactly as pleasant as it always was. Her smile was the same smile. Nothing about her delivery suggested she was aware of doing anything other than making conversation. She said, "You really didn't have to dress up. No one here knows who you are." The words had a small radius. Garrett heard them. His partner heard them. Priya, seated to my right, went very slightly still in the particular way of someone who has registered a social event and is deciding whether to respond to it. Two colleagues at the neighboring edge of the table heard, and in the pause that followed, a pause no longer than 2 seconds, two of them produced the soft, brief laugh that people use when they have witnessed something uncomfortable and do not know what else to do with it. Then someone reached for a bread roll, and the moment dissolved back into the sounds of a dinner in motion. I set down my fork. I picked up my water glass. I took one slow sip. I set it down, and something inside me went completely still. Not cold, not hardened. Still, the way a building goes still after the final section of the structural frame is locked into place, and there is nothing left for the structure to prove to anyone about whether it will hold. Finished. Load-bearing.
At rest.
I thought, you do not know. You genuinely, completely have no idea. And I thought, you are about to find out. Not from me. From the room. I did not answer her. I did not look at her for longer than a moment. I turned toward the windows and I let the city do what city lights do at night, which is remind you that the world is large enough to contain both what has just happened and everything that is still coming, and that very few insults are as final as they feel in the moment they land. I finished my appetizer. I contributed to the table conversation when I was addressed. I was present and quiet and entirely composed because I have had 17 years of practice at being present and quiet in rooms that did not believe they needed to know my name. At 7:51 p.m., Eleanor Voss stood at the small podium that had been set up at the far end of the room. She was in her late 50s, with the posture of someone who has spent decades standing in front of rooms and arrived long ago at a settled peace with her own authority. She thanked the attendees warmly. She spoke about the 3 promotions, acknowledging each person specifically, and with what was clearly genuine familiarity. Then she said there was one additional item on the agenda for the evening, something that had not been announced in the invitation. She said that Harlan Structural Group had been invited to submit for the Municipal Partners Community Impact Award, given annually by the city's Building Commission to recognize projects demonstrating technical excellence alongside measurable benefit to the surrounding community. She said the submission had been made in connection with the Greenfield District renovation, the Halloran Building remediation. She said the award had been granted. She said the submission centered on a specific event during the project. During a routine foundation inspection on November 17, 2022, the project's lead site coordinator had identified a stress fracture pattern in the east stairwell load-bearing supports, a pattern that standard assessment protocol would not have flagged for an estimated additional 14 to 18 months. The coordinator had documented the fracture progression with her own preliminary load distribution calculations, prepared a written summary with a repair timeline recommendation, and brought the finding to the structural engineering team before the next scheduled review. The repair that followed had prevented what the city's building commission formally assessed as a significant structural failure risk to an occupied residential building containing 114 units.
She paused.
She said, "The award has been granted to Iris Calloway." She said my name. I did not move for one full second. I want to be accurate about that. It was a full second, possibly longer, before anything in my body responded to what I had just heard. Then Garrett turned toward me. His expression was the expression of someone rapidly reassembling a picture that has just revealed itself to be entirely different from what it appeared. His partner began to applaud.
Priya began.
The applause spread through the room in the way it does when people understand that what they are responding to is not courtesy but recognition that has been a long time coming. It spread, and it did not stop quickly. I rose from my chair. My legs were steady. I walked to the podium and Eleanor Voss shook my hand and pressed the framed citation into my other hand and said, quietly enough that the words were only for me, "Your documentation saved that building. The commission wanted you to receive this in person." I thanked her. I turned to face the room. Daniel was standing. He was applauding and crying at the same time and making no effort to conceal either thing, which is the most purely himself he ever looks. The 15-year-old watching me read invoices at the kitchen counter is always still somewhere in his face when it does that. I held his gaze for a moment. I thought about the money order for $250. I thought about the 4 minutes in the parking lot. I thought about the 7 a.m. site walk and the graduation ceremony I had not attended. I thought, you are worth every one of those mornings. Then I looked at the table. Fiona was applauding. Her hands were moving at the correct pace, and her face was composed in the way of someone who is performing the appropriate response while conducting, beneath it, a rapid and thorough private revision of a structure she had believed was settled. Her eyes held the specific expression of someone who has just discovered that the category she assigned to a person was not only incorrect but wrong in a foundational way, wrong the way a misread load calculation is wrong, wrong in a manner that changes every decision that followed from it. The woman she had told this room not to bother learning the name of was the woman the room was standing up for. I did not hold her gaze. There was nothing that needed to be communicated between us in that moment that the room had not already said more precisely than I could have managed. I turned back to Eleanor Voss, thanked her once more, and said one thing I had not planned to say. I said that most of what I know I learned from paying close attention to things that other people had decided were beneath their notice, and that if you stay close to a structure long enough, with the right kind of patience, it will always tell you what it needs. Then I walked back to my seat and finished my dinner. Garrett spoke with me through the entirety of the dessert course, asking technically specific questions about the fracture identification process, the load calculation methodology, the documentation format I had used, and the timeline between the initial flag and the repair authorization. Priya joined the conversation. 2 colleagues from the neighboring table pulled their chairs slightly closer. By 9 p.m. the evening had become something entirely different from what it had been at 7:30. It had become a room where my presence was not a peripheral fact but a central one, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a building with an unexamined foundation and a building that has been looked at honestly. Fiona said almost nothing during that stretch of the evening. She was present. She was composed. She was quiet with the specific quality of someone who is managing a significant recalculation in real time and has not yet determined what it will require of her when it is finished. Daniel found me at the coat room at 9:22 p.m. He took hold of my shoulders the way he has done since we were young, and something had gone right, and neither of us had a ready language for it. He asked why I had not told him about the nomination. I said I had not known whether the award would be granted. He said my name in the particular tone he uses when he believes I am being deliberately evasive. I told him the evening was his. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You drove me to the campus visit. You wrote the letter Dr. Solis still talks about. You co-signed the loan, and you sent the money order, and you skipped my graduation to go to a site walk the next morning, and you have never once asked me for any of it back. I have been telling people for years that my sister built things. I don't think a single one of them understood what I meant until tonight." I looked at my brother for a long moment. I said, "You built everything yourself. I just showed you it was possible." He shook his head. He did not argue, but he shook his head. I drove home at 9:47 p.m. I parked in my usual spot and sat in the car for a minute with the engine off. Not because I was upset. Because sometimes after something large has happened you need 60 seconds before you go inside and become a person doing ordinary things again. I went inside. I changed out of the navy dress and hung it carefully on the good hanger because I thought I would want to wear it again. I put the kettle on. I stood at the kitchen window while the water heated and looked at the lights of the neighborhood. The lit windows, the street lamps, the moving headlights at the intersection of Block East, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless and unresolved for a very long time. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction in any clean, simple sense. It was something quieter than either of those things. It was the feeling of being accurately known, which is different from being praised, and which is rarer, And which matters more? Fiona called me 2 days later, on a Saturday morning at 9:11 a.m. I saw her name on the screen and let it ring twice before I answered. She said she wanted to apologize for what she had said at the table on Thursday evening. She said it was thoughtless and unkind, and that she was sorry. Her voice was careful and measured, and, within those constraints, genuine in the particular way of someone who has spent 48 hours composing what genuine is supposed to sound like, which is not the same as being insincere, but is also not entirely without architecture. I said, yes, it was. A pause. She said she had not known about the project. That Daniel had told her, in broad terms, what my work involved, but that she had not understood what it meant in practice. I said, I know you didn't. Another pause, longer. She said she would like to work toward a better relationship with me if I was open to it. I thought about October 2009, and the kitchen table, and the Friday shift. I thought about Frank Duarte's arthritis and the $12 an hour, and learning to read invoices in the kitchen at night. I thought about the green notebook in the top drawer. I thought about Dr. Renata Solis and the letter I had written on a Tuesday evening and revised twice because I needed it to be exactly right. I thought about a parking lot in the dark and 4 quiet minutes I have never described to anyone. I thought about a woman leaning across a table with a pleasant voice and a pleasant smile and saying a thing designed, however casually, to reduce me in a room that was about to stand up for me. I said, I'm open to effort, not to performance. She said that was fair. I believed that she meant it. I also believe she does not yet fully understand the difference between those two things, and that learning the difference will take time and will require her to sit with a discomfort she has not previously had much occasion to feel. I am not required to make that process easier than it needs to be, but I am also not required to close a door that a person is genuinely trying to walk through. I am keeping it open. I am not holding it for her. The citation is framed above my desk now, between the window and the shelving unit. I walk past it every morning. I do not often stop to read it. I know what it says, and the words live in me now the way things do when you encounter them at exactly the right moment in your life. But on the days when the work has been hard or the hours have been long or a room has felt smaller than it should, I glance at it and I think about what an entire city commission decided to put in writing and sign their names to without anyone asking them to be generous. They were not being generous. They were being accurate. That is all any of us who do invisible work are ever asking for. Not praise. Not apology. Just accuracy. Just someone in the room willing to say, this happened and this person did it, and it mattered. Some doors close themselves when you stop holding them open. The one I have spent my life at is one I built from the inside, without permission, without an audience, and without anyone telling me the materials were sufficient. It turns out they were. It turns out they always had been. The room just needed 34 years and one Thursday evening in March to figure out how to say so. Before you go, I want to leave you with something I think is genuinely useful. Documented evidence of your own work is not arrogance. It is protection. The green notebook I kept with Daniel's educational costs, the written summary I filed after the November 2022 inspection, the character reference I drafted and redrafted on a Tuesday night. None of those felt significant in the moment I was doing them. All of them mattered later. Write things down. Keep the records. Not because you expect anyone to disbelieve you, but because accuracy deserves to be preserved in a form that can speak without you having to raise your voice. So, I want to ask you something before this story ends. If you had been at that table on March 6th, if a woman had leaned toward you in a room full of your brother's colleagues and said, with complete pleasantness, that no one there knew who you were, would you have answered her in that moment, corrected the record yourself, and let her see immediately how wrong she was? Or would you have done what I did? Set down your fork, picked up your glass, and trusted that the truth would arrive on its own, in its own time, in the most complete way available to it. I know what I chose. I know why I chose it. And I know what the room looked like at 7:51 p.m. on a Thursday in March, when the answer came in without me having said a single word. My team and I work hard to create stories that carry something worth keeping after the video ends. Everything you have heard here is fictional, created for entertainment, for reflection, and for the belief that the work of invisible people deserves, eventually, to be named.